Welcome to Part 5 of the Cartwright Murder. Visit brooksaudiobooks.com for an awesome collection of unique, full-length audiobooks. And be sure to subscribe to be notified when new books are released. Chapter 21. It was Monday evening when we discovered the body of poor old Thomas. The night had been quiet. There was a stillness in the house, and the strange circumstances surrounding the old man's death were being kept a secret from the servants. Rosie took over the dining room and pantry since we were without a butler, and aside from the warning we received from the doctor, everything felt peaceful. Things at the Traders' Bank were moving slowly. The recent failure hit small shareholders particularly hard, including the minister at the small Methodist chapel in Casanova. He had inherited a few shares of stock in the Traders' Bank from an uncle, and his initial joy had turned to bitterness. He was forced to give up everything he had, and his feelings toward Paul Cartwright, even in death, must have been deeply resentful. He was asked to lead the simple service when the deceased banker's body was laid to rest in the Casanova churchyard, but fortunately for him, he caught a cold, and a substitute was called in. A few days after the service, he came to see me, a kind-faced man wearing a shabby frock coat and a neatly laundered tie. I could tell he was unsure of my relationship with the Cartwright family, and whether he should express sympathy or offer congratulations regarding Mr. Cartwright's passing. It didn't take long for him to find his footing. I found myself liking the little man. He had known Thomas well, and had promised to officiate at the service in the run-down African Zion church. He shared more about himself than he probably realized, and before he left, I surprised both of us by promising to provide a new carpet for his church. He was genuinely touched, and I sensed he cared for his worn chapel as a mother cares for a child in need. "You are laying up treasure, Miss Donovan," he said earnestly, "where neither moth nor rust can destroy, nor thieves break in and steal." "It is certainly a safer place than Sunnyside," I replied, and the thought of the carpet brought a smile to his face. He stood just inside the doorway, taking in the lavishness of the house and the stunning view beyond. "The wealthy should strive to be good," he said with a touch of longing. "They possess so much beauty, and beauty elevates the soul. Yet, despite my obligation to speak kindly of the late Mr. Cartwright, he never truly saw this lovely landscape. To him, these trees and lawns were not divine creations. They were mere property, measured by the acre. He worshipped money, Miss Donovan. He sacrificed everything to his golden idol. It wasn't power or ambition that consumed him, it was money." Then he dropped his sermon-like tone and turned to me with a warm smile. "Despite all this splendor," he continued, "the locals have a saying that Mr. Paul Cartwright could sit on a dollar and see everything around it. Unlike the vacationers, he never gave to the poor or to the church. He loved wealth for its own sake." "And there are no pockets in shrouds," I replied with a hint of cynicism. I sent him home in the car with a bouquet of hothouse roses for his wife, and he seemed truly touched. Meanwhile, I felt a warm satisfaction from spending on something as simple as a church carpet. I received far less joy and appreciation when I donated the new silver communion set to St. Barnabas. There was so much on my mind during those days. I made a list of questions and potential answers, but it felt like I was just going around in circles. I always found myself back where I started. My list looked something like this. Who had entered the house the night before the murder? Thomas insisted it was Mr. Morgan, whom he spotted on the pathway, the owner of the pearl cufflink. Why did Arnold Cartwright return after he had left the house the night he was killed? No answers. Was he following up on the mission Louise mentioned? Who let him in? Claire claimed she had locked the east entry. There was no key on the deceased or in the door. He must have gotten in from the inside. Who had been locked in the clothes chute? Clearly, it was someone unfamiliar with the house. There were only two people missing from our group, Rosie and Claire. Rosie was at the lodge, so could it have been Claire? Or might it have been that mysterious intruder again, the one who had confronted Rosie on the drive? Perhaps it was the same nightly visitor. It seemed more plausible that it was someone trying to uncover a secret at the lodge. Was Louise being watched? Who had passed Louise on the circular staircase? Could it have been Thomas? The key to the east entry made that a real possibility. But why would he be there if it were him? Who had made the hole in the trunk room wall? It wasn't vandalism. It had been created quietly and with intent. If only I could have deciphered the purpose behind that gaping hole, how much anxiety and mental strain I could have avoided. Why had Louise left her family and returned home to hide at the lodge? There was still no answer to this or the other pressing questions. Why did both she and Dr. Walker warn us away from the house? Who was Lucian Wallace? What had Thomas seen in the shadows the night he died? What was behind the subtle change in Claire? Was Jack Morgan an accomplice or merely a victim in the looting of the Traders' Bank? What compelling reason drove Louise to decide to marry Dr. Walker? The examiners were still poring over the Traders' Bank records, and it was likely that several weeks would pass before everything was sorted out. The team of expert accountants who had reviewed the books about 2 months prior confirmed that every bond and every valuable paper was present at that time. It was soon after their examination that the president, who had been quite unwell, traveled to California. Mr. Morgan remained ill at the Knickerbocker, and in this, as in many other ways, Claire's behavior left me perplexed. She acted as if she didn't care, stubbornly avoiding any discussion about the bank, and to my knowledge, she neither wrote to him nor visited him. Gradually, I came to believe that Claire, like the majority of the world, thought her lover was guilty. While I shared that belief, I found her indifference frustrating. Girls in my time didn't simply accept the public's judgment of the men they loved. However, something soon happened that made me suspect there was a turbulent sea of emotions beneath Claire's calm exterior. On Tuesday morning, the detective searched the grounds thoroughly, but he found nothing. He vanished later that afternoon, only to return late that night. He informed us that he would need to head back to the city the next day and coordinated with Michael and Alex to keep an eye on the house. Emily approached me Wednesday morning, her black silk apron gathered up like a bag, her eyes wide with righteous anger. It was the day of Thomas' funeral in the village, and Alex and I were in the conservatory preparing flowers for the old man's casket. Emily never seemed as pleased as when she was making herself miserable, and her mouth drooped while her eyes sparkled with triumph. I always said there were a lot of things happening right under our noses that we couldn't see, she declared, extending her apron towards me. I don't see with my nose, I replied. What is all this? Emily pushed aside a few geranium pots, clearing a space, and emptied her apron, spilling a handful of tiny scraps of paper. Alex had stepped back, but I noticed he was watching her with curiosity. Hold on a second, Emily, I said. You've been digging through the library's trash again. Emily was sorting through her scraps of paper with the expertise that came from long experience, completely ignoring me. Have you ever considered, I continued, covering the bits with my hand, that when people tear up their letters, they do so to keep them from being seen? If they weren't embarrassed about it, they wouldn't go to all that trouble, Miss Maggie, Emily replied with a tone of authority. Besides, with everything happening daily, I feel it's my responsibility. If you don't read and act on this, I'll give it to that Hartley, and I bet he won't head back to the city today. That settled it for me. If these scraps were connected to the mystery, ordinary rules didn't matter. Emily arranged the pieces as if she were solving one of those picture puzzles children play with, and she was just as enthusiastic about it. Once she was done, she stepped aside so I could read it. Wednesday night, 9 o'clock. Bridge, I read aloud. Then, noticing Alex's intense gaze, I turned my attention to Emily. Someone is supposed to play bridge tonight at 9, I said. Is that your concern or mine? Emily looked offended. She was about to respond when I quickly gathered up the scraps and left the conservatory. Now then, I said once we were outside, why do you choose to confide in Alex? He's no fool. Do you really think he believes anyone in this house is going to play bridge tonight at 9, by appointment? I assume you've mentioned it in the kitchen, and instead of me sneaking down to the bridge tonight, observing who shows up, the whole household will end up marching in. Nobody knows about it, Emily said, sounding contrite. I found it in the basket in Miss Claire's dressing room. Take a look at the back of the sheet. I flipped over some scraps, and sure enough, there it was, a blank deposit slip from Traders' Bank. So Claire was set to meet Jack Morgan that night by the bridge, and I had thought he was unwell. This avoidance of daylight in his fiancée's family hardly seemed like the behavior of an innocent man. Nevertheless, I resolved to confirm this for myself by heading to the bridge that evening. After lunch, Mr. Hartley suggested I accompany him to Richfield, and I agreed. "I'm beginning to trust Dr. Stewart's account more," he said, "especially after finding that scrap in old Thomas's pocket. It supports the idea that the woman with the child and the one who argued with Cartwright are the same person. It seems Thomas stumbled upon something that would cast the deceased in a less than favorable light, and out of loyalty to the family, he chose to keep it to himself. Your story about the woman at the cardroom window is starting to gain significance. It's the closest thing to solid information we have so far." Warner drove us to Richfield in the car. The journey was about 25 miles by rail, but we took a series of rough back roads that got us there in no time. Richfield was a charming little town along the river, and up on the hill I spotted the Mortons' large country house, where Michael and Claire had been staying until the night of the murder. Elm Street was practically the only street, and number 14 was easy to locate. It was a small, white house that looked worn without any charm, featuring a low window and a porch just a foot or so above a tiny lawn. A baby carriage sat on the path, and from a swing nearby came the sounds of a heated argument. 3 small children were loudly disputing, while a weary young woman with a gentle expression attempted to calm the ruckus. When she noticed us, she untied her gingham apron and stepped over to the porch. "Good afternoon," I greeted her. Hartley tipped his hat in silence. "I'm here to ask about a child named Lucian Wallace." "I'm glad you came," she replied. "Even with the other children around, I think the little guy feels lonely. We were hoping his mother might come by today." Mr. Hartley moved a little closer. "You're Mrs. Tate?" he asked, and I wondered how the detective already knew. "Yes, I am. Mrs. Tate, we'd like to ask you some questions. Perhaps we could do so inside." "Come right in," she said warmly. Soon we were seated in the small, worn parlor, which looked like countless others just like it. Mrs. Tate sat nervously, her hands resting in her lap. "How long has Lucian been here?" Mr. Hartley asked. "Since a week ago last Friday. His mother paid for a week's board in advance. The other week hasn't been settled yet." "Was he sick when he arrived?" "No, sir, not exactly. He was recovering from typhoid," she said, "and he seems to be doing well since he got here." "Could you tell me his mother's name and address?" "That's the issue," the young woman said, furrowing her brow. "She gave her name as Mrs. Wallace, but she didn't have an address. She was looking for a boarding house in town. She mentioned she worked in a department store and couldn't care for her child properly, so he needed fresh air and milk. I have 3 children of my own, and one more didn't make much difference in the workload, but I do wish she would pay for this week." "Did she happen to say which store?" "No, sir, but all of the boys' clothes were from King's. He has far too nice of clothing for the countryside." Just then, a loud burst of laughter and excited shouts erupted from the front door, followed by the thudding of little feet and a playful "whoa, whoa." In the room ran a duo of round-faced children, a boy and a girl, harnessed together with a clothesline and driven by a giggling boy of about 7, dressed in tan overalls with brass buttons. The small driver immediately caught my eye. He was a striking child, and though remnants of a serious illness were still visible, his skin now glowed with the clarity of good health. "Whoa, Flinders," he yelled. "You're going to wreck the trap." Mr. Hartley drew him closer by offering a lead pencil, striped in blue and yellow. "All right, then," he said once the boy had taken the pencil and was busy testing it on the detective's cuff. "I bet you don't know what your name is." "I do," replied the boy confidently. "Lucian Wallace." "Fantastic. And what's your mother's name?" "Mother, of course. What's your mother's name?" He pointed at me. "I really need to stop wearing black. It makes a woman look older." "And where did you live before you came here?" The detective managed to keep a straight face. "Grossmutter, the boy answered. I noticed Mr. Hartley's eyebrows raise. German, he remarked. Well, young man, it seems you don't know much about yourself. I've been trying all week, Mrs. Tate interjected. The boy understands a few German words, but he doesn't know where he lived or anything about himself. Mr. Hartley jotted something on a card and handed it to her. Mrs. Tate, he said, I need you to do something. Here's some money for the phone call. The moment the boy's mother arrives, please call that number and ask for the person whose name is on the card. You can quickly run over to the drugstore on an errand and do it discreetly. Just say, the lady has come. The lady has come, Mrs. Tate echoed. Very well, sir. I hope it won't be long. The milk bill alone is almost double what it was. How much is the child's board? I inquired. $3 a week, including his laundry. All right, I said. Now, Mrs. Tate, I'm going to pay for last week's board and a week in advance. If the mother arrives, she must remain completely unaware of this visit, not a single word of it. In exchange for your silence, you may use this money for something for your own children. Her weary, worn face lit up, and I noticed her glance at the little Tate's small feet. I understood then that shoes for the genteel poor could be nearly as costly as food. On our way back, Mr. Hartley made only one comment, and it seemed to weigh heavily on him, as if he were grappling with a deep sense of disappointment. Is King's a place for children's clothing? He asked. Not exactly. It's a general department store. He fell silent after that, but once we got home, he immediately went to the telephone and called King and Company in the city. After a bit, he reached the general manager, and they talked for a while. When Mr. Hartley hung up the receiver, he turned to me. The plot thickens, he said with that familiar smile of his. There are 4 women named Wallace at King's, none of them married, and all under 20. I think I'll head to the city tonight. I want to visit the children's hospital. But before I go, Miss Donovan, I would appreciate your honesty. I need you to show me the revolver you found in the tulip bed. So he had known all along. It was indeed a revolver, Mr. Hartley, I confessed, finally feeling cornered. But I can't show it to you. I no longer have it. Chapter 22. During dinner, Mr. Hartley suggested sending someone in his place for a few days, but Michael was confident that there would be no further trouble, and felt that he and Alex could handle things. The detective left for town early in the evening, and by 9 o'clock, Michael, who had been playing golf to distract himself from his worries, was sound asleep on the big leather couch in the living room. I sat nearby, knitting, and pretended not to notice when Claire got up and slipped outside into the starlight. Once I was sure she had gone, I quietly followed. I had no intention of eavesdropping, but I needed to confirm that she was indeed meeting Jack Morgan. Too many incidents had happened in which Claire was either involved or appeared to be involved, so I couldn't leave anything to chance. I walked slowly across the lawn, avoiding the hedge, until I reached an opening near the lodge and found myself on the open road. To my left, about 100 feet away, the path led across the valley to the country club, and not far off was the footbridge over Casanova Creek. Just as I was about to head down that path, I heard footsteps approaching and quickly ducked into the bushes. It was Claire, hurrying back toward the house. I was taken aback. I waited until she was nearly at the house before starting to move again, stepping back into the shadows. The reason Claire hadn't kept her meeting was clear. Leaning on the railing of the bridge in the moonlight, smoking a pipe, was Alex, the gardener. I felt a surge of anger toward Emily for carelessly leaving the torn note where he could overhear. I could have gladly choked Alex for his boldness, but there was nothing to be done about it. I turned and followed Claire slowly back to the house. The frequent disruptions to our home had made it nearly impossible to feel relaxed after dark. We had increased our watchfulness over the locks and window fasteners, but as Mr. Hartley had suggested, we allowed the east door to remain secured only by the Yale lock. Keeping just one entrance for the intruder and maintaining a constant watch in the darkness at the bottom of the circular staircase seemed our best option. With the detective absent, Alex and Michael arranged a schedule to alternate their watch. Michael would be on duty from 10 to 2, and Alex from 2 until 6. Each man carried a weapon, and as an extra precaution, the one off duty slept in a room near the top of the circular staircase with his door open, ready for any emergencies. We kept these plans hidden from the servants, who had only just begun to settle down for the night, each retiring with barred doors and lamps burning brightly until morning. The house was calm again on Wednesday night. It had been nearly a week since Louise had encountered someone on the stairs, and 4 days since we discovered the hole in the trunk room wall. Arnold Cartwright and his father lay side by side in the Casanova churchyard, while at the Zion African church on the hill, a new grave marked the final resting place of poor Thomas. Louise was in town with her mother, and aside from a polite note of thanks directed at me, we hadn't heard from her since. Dr. Walker had resumed his practice, and we would occasionally see him rushing past on the road, always in a hurry. The murder of Arnold Cartwright remained unavenged, and I was determined to stay at Sunnyside until the situation was at least somewhat resolved. Yet, despite the quiet, it was Wednesday night that perhaps saw the boldest attempt to break into the house. On Thursday afternoon, the laundress sent word that she wished to speak with me, and I met her in my private sitting room, a small space beyond the dressing room. Mary Ann appeared quite flustered. She had rolled down her sleeves and tied a white apron around her waist, standing there making folds in it with fingers that were red and glossy from the soap suds. "Well, Mary," I said encouragingly, "what's wrong? Don't tell me the soap is all gone." "No, ma'am, Miss Donovan." She had a nervous habit of darting her gaze from one of my eyes to the other, her own eyes shifting back and forth, right eye, right eye, until I felt myself mirroring her movements. "No, ma'am. I was wondering if you wanted the ladder left up the clothes chute." "The what?" I exclaimed, regretting it immediately. Mary Ann's suspicions had been confirmed, and I could see her go pale, her eyes darting even more wildly. "There's a ladder in the clothes chute, Miss Donovan," she said. "It's stuck up there so tight I can't move it, and I didn't want to ask for help until I spoke to you." It was pointless to pretend. Mary Ann knew, just as well as I did, that the ladder was out of place. I decided to put her on the defensive right away. "So you didn't lock up the laundry last night?" "I locked it tight, and I put the key on the nail in the kitchen." "All right, then you must have forgotten a window." Mary Ann hesitated. "Yes, ma'am," she finally admitted. "I thought I locked them all, but there was one open this morning." I stepped out of the room and down the hallway, with Mary Ann following closely. The door to the clothes chute was securely bolted, and when I opened it, I saw the proof of her story. A pruning ladder had been taken from where it had leaned against the stable and now stood upright in the clothes shaft, its end resting against the wall between the first and second floors. I turned to Mary. "This is because of your carelessness," I said. "If we had all been killed in our beds, it would have been your fault," she shivered. "Now, let's not speak of this around the house, and send Alex to me." Alex's reaction was one of explosive rage, but I sensed there was a part of him that relished it. Looking back, I can now see so many details that I missed at the time. It all seems so clear now, and yet what happened was so extraordinary that I suppose my ignorance was forgivable. Alex leaned down the chute, inspecting the ladder closely. "It's stuck," he said, a grim smile on his face. "The idiots left us a warning like this. The only problem is, Miss Donovan, I doubt they'll be back any time soon." "I wouldn't view that as a tragedy," I replied. Until late that evening, Michael and Alex toiled at the chute. Eventually, they managed to force down the ladder and installed a new bolt on the door. As for me, I sat in a daze, wondering if I had a deadly enemy intent on my ruin. My nerves were fraying. Emily had abandoned all pretense of courage and now slept in my dressing room on the couch, a prayer book and a kitchen knife tucked beneath her pillow, ready for both real and imagined threats. That was the state of affairs that Thursday night, when I decided to join the fight. Chapter 23. Around 9 o'clock that evening, Emily walked into the living room and shared that one of the housemaids claimed she had seen 2 men slip around the corner of the stable. Claire had been sitting there, lost in thought, flinching at every sound, and now she turned to Emily with irritation. "Honestly, Emily," she said, "you're a bundle of nerves. So what if Eliza saw some men by the stable? It could have been Warner and Alex." "Warner is in the kitchen, miss," Emily replied with a touch of dignity. "If you had been through what I have, you'd be on edge too. Miss Maggie, I would appreciate it if you could give me my month's wages tomorrow. I'm going to stay with my sister." "Fine," I said, surprising her. "I'll prepare the check. Warner can take you to the noon train." The look on Emily's face was quite amusing. "You'll have a lovely time at your sister," I continued. "5 children, right?" "That's right," Emily said, suddenly bursting into tears. "You're sending me away after all these years, and your new shawl is only half finished, and who will even know how to prepare the water for your bath? It's about time I learned to prepare my own bath anyway." I said this while knitting absent-mindedly, but Claire stood up and wrapped her arms around Emily's trembling shoulders. "You're both acting like children," she said gently. "Neither of you could manage for an hour without the other, so stop bickering and be kind. Emily, go upstairs and lay out Auntie's night things. She's going to bed early." Once Emily left, I started to ponder the men by the stable, and my anxiety grew. Michael was idly knocking the billiard balls around in the billiard room, so I called out to him. "Michael," I said as he strolled in, "is there a policeman in Casanova?" "Constable," he replied with a straight face. "A war veteran, one arm. He's in office to keep the GAR folks happy." "Why?" "Because I feel uneasy tonight," I replied, explaining what Emily had said. "Is there anyone you can think of who could keep an eye on the outside of the house tonight?" "We could ask Sam Bohannon from the club," he suggested thoughtfully. "It wouldn't be a bad idea. He's a clever fellow, and in the dark, with his mouth shut and his shirt front covered, you wouldn't be able to see him from a yard away." Michael talked it over with Alex, and within an hour we had Sam. His instructions were straightforward. There had been several attempts to break into the house, and our goal wasn't just to scare off intruders, but to catch them. If Sam spotted anything unusual outside, he was to tap at the east entry where Alex and Michael would take turns watching throughout the night. I felt a sense of comfort and security as I went to bed that night. The door between Claire's room and mine was open, and with the hallway doors bolted, we were safe enough, though Emily continued to insist that doors wouldn't keep our troubles away. As before, Michael kept watch at the east entry from 10 until 2. He was mindful of comfort and chose to sit in a large, deep oak chair. We went upstairs rather early, and through the open door, Claire and I chatted away. Emily was brushing my hair while Claire worked on her own, sweeping her strong, round arms gracefully. "Did you know Mrs. Cartwright and Louise are in the village?" Claire called out. "No," I responded, taken aback. "How did you find that out?" "I ran into the oldest Stewart girl today, the doctor's daughter. She told me they didn't go back to town after the funeral. They went straight to that little yellow house next to Dr. Walker's and seemed to be settling in. They even took the house furnished for the summer." "Really, it's such a tiny place," I said. "I can't picture Fanny Cartwright living in a house like that." "It's true, though. Ella Stewart says Mrs. Cartwright has really aged, and looks like she can barely walk." I lay there, mulling over these thoughts until midnight. The electric lights dimmed gradually until only a red glow remained in the bulb, which then flickered out, leaving us in the darkness of another night. It felt like only a few moments had passed while my eyes adjusted to the lack of light. Then I noticed a faint pinkish glow reflecting off the windows. Emily spotted it at the same time and jumped up. Just then, Sam's deep voice boomed up from somewhere below. "Fire!" he shouted. "The stable's on fire." I could see him hopping up and down on the driveway, and a moment later Michael joined him. Alex woke up and rushed down the stairs, and within 5 minutes of discovering the fire, 3 of the maids were sitting on their trunks in the driveway, even though, besides a few embers, the nearest flames were 100 yards away. Claire rarely loses her cool, so she dashed to the telephone. But by the time the Casanova Volunteer Fire Department arrived, panting up the hill, the stable had turned into a furnace, with the dragon fly-safe but singed in the road. Just as the fire department got to work, a can of gasoline exploded, rattling their nerves as well as the burning structure. Being on a hill, the stable blazed like a beacon, drawing townsfolk from every direction. Rumors spread that Sunnyside was ablaze, and it was astonishing how many people threw on something over their night clothes and rushed to the fire. It seemed Casanova didn't have many fires, and Sunnyside was providing the thrill they hadn't experienced in years. The stable was attached to the west wing. I couldn't quite fathom why I suddenly thought of the circular staircase and the unguarded door at its base. Emily was folding my clothes into sheets, ready to throw them out the window when I found her, and I could hardly get her to stop. "I need you to come with me, Emily," I said. "Grab a candle and a couple of blankets." She hesitated when she saw I was headed for the east wing, and at the top of the stairs, she stopped completely. "I'm not going down there," she insisted. "There's no one at the door down there," I urged. "Who knows? This might be a trick to draw everyone's attention away from this side of the house, letting someone sneak in here." As soon as I said it, I felt certain I had found the answer, and that it might already be too late. I thought I heard quiet footsteps on the east porch, but the shouting outside made it impossible to be sure. Emily looked ready to pull back. "Fine," I said. "I'll go down alone. Go back to Mr. Michael's room and grab his revolver. Don't fire it unless you hear something. Just remember I'll be down there. And hurry." I set the candle on the floor at the top of the staircase and slipped off my bedroom slippers. Then I crept down, moving slowly and listening intently. I was so tense that fear was a distant thought. Like those on death row who managed to sleep and eat the night before execution, I couldn't feel dread anymore. It was behind me. Just as I reached the foot of the stairs, I stubbed my toe on Michael's large chair, forcing me to balance on one foot in silence until the pain faded to a dull throb. Then I knew I was right. Someone was trying to turn a key in the lock. For some reason, it wouldn't work, and the key was pulled away. I heard voices muttering outside. I had only a moment. Another attempt, and the door would open. The candle above flickered dimly down the staircase, and at that moment I quickly came up with a plan. The heavy oak chair nearly filled the space between the newel post and the door. With a loud crash, I tipped it on its side, wedging it against the door with its legs pressing against the stairs. I heard a faint scream from Emily at the noise, and then she rushed down the stairs, revolver held straight in front of her. "Thank God," she said, her voice trembling. "I thought it was you." I pointed to the door, and she understood immediately. "Call out to the windows at the other end of the house," I whispered. "Run! Tell them not to wait for anything." She dashed back up the stairs, taking 2 steps at a time. I could tell she must have collided with the candle, because it went out, plunging me into darkness. I was surprisingly composed. I remember stepping over the chair and pressing my ear to the door, feeling it shift slightly in the darkness as it was pushed from the other side. But the chair held firm, even though I could hear one of the legs creaking ominously. Then, without warning, the cardroom window shattered with a crash. I had my finger on the trigger of the revolver, and as I jumped, it fired through the door. I heard someone outside curse loudly, and for the first time I understood what was said. "Just a scratch. Men are at the other end of the house. We've got the whole nest on us." There was plenty of profanity I won't repeat. The voices gathered by the broken window now, and though I was trembling violently, I resolved to hold them off until help arrived. I crept up the stairs until I could see into the cardroom, or rather through it to the window. As I peered in, a small figure swung his leg over the sill and stepped into the room. The curtain momentarily threw him off, but he quickly turned away from me and headed for the billiard room door. I fired once more, and something fragile, either glass or china, shattered on the floor. I dashed up the stairs and along the corridor towards the main staircase. Claire was there, trying to pinpoint the source of the shots, and I must have appeared quite a sight, my hair styled in crimps, my dressing gown billowing around me, barefoot, and gripping a revolver. I had no time for conversation. I could hear footsteps echoing in the lower hall, and then someone hurried up the stairs. I think I had lost my mind. Leaning over the stair railing, I fired again. Michael, below, shouted up at me. "What are you doing up there?" he called out. "You missed me by an inch." And then I fell apart and fainted. When I came to, Emily was gently massaging my temples with eau de quinine, and the search was in full swing. The intruder was long gone. The stable had burned down, with the crowd cheering as each rafter fell, while the volunteer fire department doused the flames with a garden hose. Inside the house, Alex and Michael combed every nook of the lower floor, but they found no one. The evidence of my story lay in the broken window and the overturned chair. It seemed almost impossible for the intruder to have made it upstairs. He hadn't used the main staircase. There was no access to the upper floor in the east wing, and Emily had been at the window in the west wing, where the servants' staircase went up. But we didn't go to bed at all. Sam Bohannon and Warner joined in the search, and no closet went unchecked. Even the cellars underwent a thorough examination, but yielded nothing. The door in the east entry had a bullet hole in it, angling downward, with the bullet lodged in the porch. Reddish stains indicated that the deed had been done. "Someone will be left limping," Michael remarked after he inspected the path of the bullet. "It's too low to have struck anything other than a leg or a foot." From that moment on, I scrutinized everyone I encountered for a limp, and even now, a man with a noticeable halt catches my eye with suspicion. But in Casanova, there were no men with limps. The closest resemblance was an old man who operated the safety gates at the railroad, and I learned he had 2 prosthetic legs. Our man had vanished, and the large, lavish stable at Sunnyside was reduced to a mound of smoking rafters and charred timber. Warner insisted that the fire was deliberately set, and considering the earlier attempt to break into the house, there seemed to be little doubt about it. Chapter 24. If Michael had been completely open with me throughout the whole ordeal, everything would have been much easier. Had he shared his suspicions about Jack Morgan right after the fire, we could have avoided the distressing time that put the boy in danger. But young people often refuse to heed their elders' experiences, and it's often the elders who end up suffering. I was worn out the day after the fire, and Claire insisted that I get out. Our car was temporarily out of commission, and we had sent the carriage horses to a farm for the summer. Eventually, Claire managed to borrow a trap from the Casanova livery, and we set out. As we turned off the drive onto the road, we passed a woman who had set down a small suitcase and was examining the house and grounds closely. I might have overlooked her completely if it weren't for her face, horrifically scarred by smallpox. "Ah!" Claire exclaimed after we had passed. "What a face! I'll be dreaming about that tonight. Come on, Flinders." "Flinders?" I asked, confused. "Is that the horse's name?" "It is." She playfully flicked the horse's short mane with her whip. "He doesn't look like a livery horse, and the liveryman said he got him from the Cartwrights when they bought a couple of cars and reduced their stable. Nice Flinders, you good old boy." Flinders certainly wasn't a typical name for a horse, yet that little horse with the prancing curls that belonged to the boy at Richfield was also called Flinders. It got me thinking. At my request, Michael had already informed the agent we had dealt with about the fire. He had also called Mr. Hartley and cautiously briefed him on the previous night's events. Mr. Hartley promised to come out that evening, bringing another man with him. I didn't feel it was necessary to inform Mrs. Cartwright in the village. She had to know about the fire, and considering my refusal to leave the house, meeting with her would likely have been quite tense. But as we approached Dr. Walker's white and green house, a thought struck me. "Pull over here, Claire," I said. "I'm getting out." "To see Louise?" she asked, her curiosity evident. "No, I want to ask this young Walker something." I could tell she was intrigued, but I didn't take the time to explain further. I walked up the pathway to the house, where a brass sign announced the office, and stepped inside. The reception area was empty, but I could hear 2 voices from the consulting room, clearly not on friendly terms. "It's an outrageous charge," someone was fuming. Then I heard the doctor's calm voice, evidently not arguing but simply stating facts. I didn't have time to eavesdrop on what was likely a dispute over a bill, so I cleared my throat. The voices fell silent, a door clicked shut, and the doctor walked in from the hallway, his expression shifting to one of surprise upon seeing me. "Good afternoon, Doctor," I said, keeping my tone formal. "I won't keep you from your patient. I just need to ask you a quick question. Would you like to sit down?" "That won't be necessary. Doctor, has anyone come to see you this morning or today regarding a gunshot wound?" "Nothing so dramatic has occurred in my practice," he replied. "A gunshot wound sounds like things are rather exciting at Sunnyside." I didn't say it was at Sunnyside, but as it happens, it was. If any such case comes to you, could you please let me know? "I'd be more than happy to," he said. "I hear you've had a fire up there too. A fire and a shooting in one night, quite a stir for a quiet place like that." "It's as calm as a factory floor," I shot back as I turned to leave. "And you're still planning to stay?" "Until they burn me out," I answered. As I descended the steps, I suddenly turned around. "Doctor," I ventured, "have you ever heard of a child named Lucian Wallace?" Despite his usual cleverness, his expression changed and tightened. He quickly put up his guard. "Lucian Wallace," he echoed. "No, I don't think so. There are plenty of Wallaces around, but I don't know any Lucian." I was almost certain he did. People rarely lie to me, and this man was definitely lying. But there was no point in pressing further. His defenses were up. I walked away, half irritated and completely puzzled. Our welcome at Dr. Stewart's was entirely different. As we were embraced by the warmth of the family, with Flinders tied outside and munching on grass by the roadside, Claire and I enjoyed some homemade elderberry wine and briefly recounted the events of the fire. Naturally, we kept the more troubling details to ourselves. When we finally left the family on the porch, and the good doctor was untying our horse, I asked him the same question I had posed to Dr. Walker. "Shot," he exclaimed. "Good heavens, no. What on earth have you been up to at the big house, Miss Donovan?" "Someone attempted to enter the house during the fire and was shot and slightly injured," I replied quickly. "Please don't bring it up. We want to keep it as low-key as possible." There was one more route we could explore. At Casanova Station, I approached the station master and inquired if any trains had left between 1 o'clock and dawn. He informed me there were none until 6 in the morning. My next question required a bit more finesse. "Did you happen to notice a man who limped a little on the 6 o'clock train?" I asked. "Please think back. We're trying to trace someone who was seen loitering around Sunnyside last night before the fire." His attention was instantly captured. "I was up there myself during the fire," he said eagerly. "I'm a member of the volunteer fire company." It was the first big fire we'd had since the summer house burned down by the golf club. My wife had been saying the other day, "Dave, you might as well have saved the money on that helmet and shirt." But then last night, they proved to be useful. I rang that bell so hard I barely had time to put them on. "Did you see a man who was limping?" Claire asked, interjecting as he paused to catch his breath. "Not at the train, ma'am," he replied. "No one like that got on here today, but I did see a limping man. I didn't stick around after the fire company left. There's a fast freight that goes through at 4:45, and I needed to get to the station. I could see there wasn't much more to do at the fire since we had the flames under control." Claire smiled at me, and he continued, so I started down the hill. There were a few people heading home, and along the path to the country club, I spotted 2 men. One of them was short and was sitting on a big rock, facing away from me, doing something with his foot that looked like he was tying up a wound. After I walked a little further, I glanced back and saw him hobbled along, and "Excuse me, miss," he was cursing up a storm. "Did they head toward the club?" Claire asked suddenly, leaning forward. "No, miss. I think they headed into the village. I didn't catch a glimpse of their faces, but I know everyone in town, and everyone knows me. When they didn't acknowledge me in my uniform, I figured they were strangers." So all we had to show for our afternoon's work was this. Someone had been shot by a bullet that went through the door. He hadn't left the village, and he hadn't called for a doctor. Also, Dr. Walker knew who Lucian Wallace was, and his outright denial gave me confidence that, At least in that direction, we were on the right track. The fact that the detective would be there that night was the most uplifting thing of all, and I sensed even Claire was pleased about it. As I drove home that afternoon, I caught a glimpse of her in the bright sunlight for the first time in days, and I was taken aback by how unwell she looked. She appeared thin and pale, her once vibrant spirit completely dimmed. "Claire," I said, "I've been such a selfish old woman. You're leaving this miserable house tonight. Annie Morton is heading to Scotland next week, and you'll go with her." To my surprise, her face flushed painfully. "I don't want to go, Aunt Ray," she replied. "Please don't make me leave now." "You're losing your health and your beauty," I insisted. "You really need a change of scenery." "I won't budge," she declared just as firmly. Then, with a lighter tone, she added, "You and Emily need me around to settle your arguments every day of the week." Perhaps I was becoming overly cautious, but I sensed Claire's cheerfulness was forced and fake. I kept a watchful eye on her for the rest of the drive, and I didn't like the 2 vibrant spots of red on her pale cheeks. But I chose not to mention sending her to Scotland again. I knew she wouldn't agree to it. Chapter 25. That day was sure to be eventful. As I stepped into the house, I found Eliza situated in the upper hall on a chair, Mary Ann desperately trying to subdue her with household ammonia, and Emily diligently rubbing Eliza's wrists, though I couldn't see how that was supposed to help. It was clear that the ghost had been roaming again, and this time it was in broad daylight. Eliza was in a state of utter panic. She grabbed my sleeve when I approached her and wouldn't let go until she had shared her tale. The household was already in disarray after the fire, so it came as no surprise to me when I saw Alex and the under-gardener struggling to carry a heavy trunk down the stairs together. "I didn't want to do it, Miss Donovan," Alex said, catching his breath. But she was so worked up, I was afraid she might try to drag it down herself and ruin the staircase. Meanwhile, I was attempting to remove my bonnet while shushing the maids. "Now, Eliza, once you've washed your face and stopped crying," I said, "come into my sitting room and tell me what happened." Emily silently put away my things, her shoulders stiff with disapproval. "Well," I said, sensing the silence was becoming awkward, "it looks like things are heating up around here." Still silence from Emily, followed by a long sigh. "If Eliza leaves, I won't know where to find another cook." More silence. "Rosie could probably cook well enough," I offered. A sniff from Emily. "Emily," I said at last, "don't even try to deny that you're enjoying this chaos. You positively thrive on the excitement. You've never looked better. I think all this running around and being shaken up has done wonders for that lazy liver of yours." "I'm not just thinking about myself," she replied, provoked into speaking. "Maybe my liver was lazy, or maybe it wasn't, but I can tell you this. I still have some feelings left, and seeing you standing at the bottom of that staircase and shooting through the door has changed me forever." "Well, I'm glad to hear that. Anything for a change, I suppose," I remarked. Just then, Eliza burst in, accompanied by Rosie and Mary Ann. Her account, punctuated by sobs and interruptions from the other 2, went like this: "At 2:00, or was it 2:15? Rosie insisted on the latter. She had gone upstairs to retrieve a picture from her room to show Mary Ann. A picture of a lady, Mary Ann chimed in. She made her way up the servants' staircase and along the corridor to her room, which was positioned between the trunk room and the unfinished ballroom. As she walked down the corridor, she heard a sound, like someone moving furniture, but she wasn't scared. She thought it could be men checking the house following the fire the previous night, yet when she peeked into the trunk room, there was no one inside. She quietly entered her room, and the noise had stopped. All was still. Then she sat on the edge of her bed, feeling faint as she was prone to spells. "I mentioned that when I arrived, didn't I, Rosie?" "Yes, indeed you did." So she laid her head down on her pillow and... "Took a nap, got it," I said. "Keep going." "When I woke up, Miss Donovan, I swear I thought I was going to die. Something hit me in the face, and I shot up, startled. Then I saw the plaster falling from a small hole in the wall. Before I knew it, an iron bar that long, she measured it to be almost 2 yards, shut through that hole and landed on the bed. If I had still been asleep, I said, I would have been hit on the head and killed. I wish you had heard her scream, Mary Ann chimed in. Her face was as pale as a pillowcase when she fell down the stairs. There's probably a simple explanation for it, Eliza, I suggested. You might have dreamed it during your fainting spell, but if it's true, the metal rod and the hole in the wall will prove it. Eliza looked a bit embarrassed. The hole's definitely there, Miss Donovan, she replied, but the rod was gone when Mary Ann and Rosie went upstairs to pack my trunk. That's not all, Emily said from a shadowy corner. Eliza claimed that from the hole in the wall, a burning eye looked down at her. The wall must be at least 6 inches thick, I replied sharply. Unless the person who made that hole had their eyes on the end of a stick, there's no way Eliza could have seen them. Yet the facts remained, and a visit to Eliza's room confirmed it. I could scoff all I wanted. Someone had indeed drilled a hole in the unfinished wall of the ballroom, piercing through the bricks of the partition, and blasting through the unyielding plaster of Eliza's room with such force that the rod had landed on her bed. I had gone upstairs by myself, and I admit I was puzzled. In a few places along the wall, small openings had been made, none of them very deep. What was most perplexing was the disappearance of the metal tool used for the job. I recalled a story I had read about a mischievous dwarf living in the spaces between the double walls of an old castle. I wondered if my initial thought of a secret entrance to a hidden chamber might be right after all, and if we were hosting some erratic guest who played tricks on us in the dark, carefully listening to our bewildered investigations while remaining hidden away. Mary Ann and Eliza set off that afternoon, but Rosie decided to stay behind. Around 5 o'clock, a carriage arrived from the station to pick them up, and to my surprise, it had a passenger. Matthew Geist, the driver, asked for me and shared his news with pride. "I've brought you a cook, Miss Donovan," he announced. When the message came to pick up 2 girls and their trunks, I figured something was happening, and since this woman was looking for work in the village, I thought I'd bring her along. By then, I had developed the typical suburban habit of trusting servants without question. I no longer insisted on solid, verifiable references. Maggie Donovan, had come to accept if a cook settled in comfortably in my sitting room while taking orders for the day, and I was just relieved if the silver wasn't cleaned with scouring soap. So that day, I simply told Emily to send in the new applicant. However, when she walked in, I could hardly contain my shock. It was the woman with the scarred face. She stood a bit awkwardly just inside the door, but her self-assurance was striking. Yes, she could cook. She wasn't fancy, but she could whip up good soups and desserts if someone else handled the salads. In the end, I decided to hire her. As Michael remarked when we told him, it didn't matter much what the cook looked like, as long as she was clean. I've mentioned Michael's restlessness. That day, his urge to be out seemed stronger than ever, keeping him away until after lunch. I think he was hoping to spot Louise driving over the hills in her runabout. He might have seen her now and then, but from his persistent brooding, I sensed that their situation hadn't changed. During the afternoon, I had Claire with me, and at dinner, both of us noticed that something had distracted him. He was unusually surly, which was out of character for him, visibly anxious, glancing at his watch every few minutes, and barely touching his food. Throughout the meal, he asked twice about the arrival of Mr. Hartley and the other detective, and during long stretches of silence, he seemed lost in thought, absent-mindedly digging his fork into the fine damask cloth and not registering when we spoke to him. He declined dessert and left the table early, claiming he wanted to see Alex. However, Alex was nowhere to be found. It was after 8 when Michael ordered the car, setting off down the hill at a reckless speed, even for him. Shortly after, Alex mentioned he was ready to check over the house in preparation for closing up for the night. Sam Bohannon arrived at 8:45 and began his patrol of the grounds, and with the 2 detectives arriving soon, I felt relatively at ease. At 9:30, I heard the frantic sound of a horse racing up the drive. It skidded to a halt in front of the house, and soon after, hurried footsteps were heard on the veranda. Our nerves were on edge, and Claire, who had been particularly anxious lately, rushed to the door. Moments later, Louise burst into the room, her hair down and breathless. "Where, Michael?" she demanded. Her eyes, large and dark against her plain black dress, looked grim, and the rushed ride had drained all color from her face. I rose and pulled out a chair for her. "He hasn't come back," I said softly. "Sit down, dear. You're not strong enough for this." I don't think she even heard me. "He hasn't come back," she asked, glancing between me and Claire. "Do you know where he went? Where can I find him?" "For heaven's sake, Louise," Claire exclaimed, "please tell us what's wrong. Michael is not here. He went to the station for Mr. Hartley. What happened?" "To the station, Claire. Are you sure?" "Yes," I replied. "Listen." The train's whistle can be heard now. She relaxed somewhat at our straightforward tone and let herself sink into a chair. "Maybe I was wrong," she said with a heavy sigh. "He should be here soon if everything's gone well." We sat there together, the three of us, without making any effort to talk. Claire and I understood the futility of asking Louise questions. Her silence was part of a role she'd taken on. We strained to hear the first hint of the car as it turned into the driveway and started its ascent to the house. 10 minutes passed, then 15, then 20. I noticed Louise's hands growing tense as they gripped the arms of her chair. I watched as Claire's bright complexion gradually faded, and I felt a tightening pressure around my own heart. After 25 minutes, we heard a sound, but it wasn't the expected hum of the car. It was the unmistakable rumble of the Casanova hack. Claire pulled aside the curtain and peered into the darkness. "It's the hack, I'm sure," she said, visibly relieved. "Something must have happened to the car, and with the way Michael drove down the hill, it's no surprise." It felt like an eternity before the creaking vehicle came to a halt at the door. Louise got up and stood there, her hand resting on her throat. Then Claire opened the door, letting in Mr. Hartley and a stocky, middle-aged man. Michael was not among them. As the door shut and Louise realized Michael hadn't come, her expression shifted. From tense anticipation to relief, and then to utter despair. Her face was like an open book. "Michael," I asked bluntly, ignoring the stranger, "didn't he come with you?" "No," Mr. Hartley looked a bit surprised. "I expected to see him in the car, but we made it here just fine." "You didn't see him at all?" Louise asked, her voice breathless. Mr. Hartley recognized her instantly, despite having never seen her before. She had stayed hidden in her rooms until the morning she left. "No, Miss Cartwright," he replied. "I didn't see him at all." "What's the matter?" "We need to find him," she insisted. "Every moment counts. Mr. Hartley, I believe he's in danger, but I can't explain why. He must be located." The stocky man remained silent, but now he moved swiftly toward the door. "I'll grab the hack down the road and flag it down," he said. "Is the gentleman in town?" "Mr. Hartley," Louise said impulsively, "I'll take the hack. Use my horse and carriage outside and drive as fast as you can. Look for the dragonfly. It should be easy to track. I can't think of any other option. Just don't waste a moment." The new detective was gone, and a moment later Hartley dashed down the drive, the hooves of his cob striking sparks with each step. Louise watched them leave. When she turned around, she faced Claire, who stood in the hall, outraged and almost tragic. "You know what's threatening Michael, Louise," she said sharply. "I believe you know everything about this dreadful mystery we're facing. If anything happens to Michael, I won't forgive you." Louise threw her hands up in despair and let them drop. "He means as much to me as he does to you," she said softly. "I tried to warn him." "That's nonsense," I replied, trying to sound upbeat. "We're making a big deal out of something that might be minor. Michael is probably just running late. He's always late. We could hear the car any moment now." But it didn't arrive. After half an hour of anxious waiting, Louise slipped out quietly and didn't return. I barely noticed her absence until I heard the station hack pulling away. At 11 o'clock, the phone rang. It was Mr. Hartley. "I found the dragonfly, Miss Donovan," he said. "It's collided with a freight car on the siding above the station. Mr. Donovan wasn't there, but we'll likely find him. Have Warner get the car. But they didn't find him. At 4 o'clock the next morning, we were still anxiously awaiting news, with Alex keeping a watchful eye on the house and Sam monitoring the grounds. As dawn broke, I finally succumbed to exhaustion and fell into a deep sleep. Michael still hadn't returned, and there was no update from the detective.